Richard Brandon III stood alone in his corner office on the 42nd floor of downtown Chicago, watching the city lights flicker to life below him. The clock read 9:47 p.m. His net worth sat at $47 million, displayed on the screen in front of him like a scoreboard in a game he'd been winning his entire adult life. He should have felt something. Pride, maybe. Security. Peace. Instead, he felt terrified. Because Richard understood something fundamental about his own success that he'd never let anyone else see. It was all performance. Every polished word, every confident handshake, every deal he'd closed. It was a story he'd learned to tell himself so convincingly that most people forgot to ask if it was true. 20 years earlier, Richard was a different version of this same fear. A state university business degree that taught him nothing useful. 3 jobs in rapid succession, each one ending the same way. His bosses deciding he was too aggressive, too ambitious, too willing to make promises his employers couldn't keep. He ate ramen 3 times daily. His car was held together with duct tape in desperation. He had nothing except one terrifying talent. He could sell anything to anyone, mostly because he was selling the person he wished he was instead of the person he actually was. By 2010, Brandon Digital Marketing was managing 17 accounts. By 2012, that number had tripled. By 2015, he'd moved his operation to a gleaming downtown office and purchased his starter castle, a $1.2 million suburban home with Madison, his wife of 2 years, though his name went on the deed first. He kept telling himself this house was just the beginning. Each acquisition was supposed to fill the empty space inside him. None of them did. Madison, even thinking her name carried the weight of something he was avoiding. They'd married in 2013, right after she'd quit her 6-figure CFO position to join his company as his chief operating officer. Small ceremony, her parents' preference, her agreement. She'd been building his business empire with her own hands while he learned to take credit for it. She'd been everything: partner, wife, infrastructure, and lately she'd been the thing he was running from. The money was real. The office was real. The house was real. But Richard was still performing, and his wife was beginning to see through it. He'd built an entire existence on the foundation of appearing successful rather than being successful. And the reason he stood alone in this office at nearly 10 p.m., staring at $47 million and feeling nothing but panic, was because he understood, on a level he'd never admit to anyone, that if people ever looked too closely, if they ever asked the right questions about where his ideas actually came from, if they ever connected the dots between his public success and the actual work being done behind the scenes by people whose names he'd learned to forget to mention, everything would collapse. It was a thought that kept him awake at night. Not the money. He had enough of that now that he never needed to worry. It was the exposure he feared. The moment when someone finally realized that Richard Brandon III wasn't brilliant. He was just good at taking credit for other people's brilliance. He didn't know it yet, but that moment was coming. Success built on lies always requires more lies to maintain it, and eventually even the best performer runs out of new material. While Richard was practicing his confidence in front of the mirror, Madison was working. It was 11:34 p.m., and she was still in the office. The year was 2016. She'd been married to Richard for 3 years. She'd been with Brandon Digital Marketing for 5 years. In that time, she'd built the infrastructure that made Richard's dreams actually function. Not possible, actual, working, real. Madison was 42 years old. She'd spent her entire adult life making other people's ideas executable. She had a gift for seeing the gaps, the places where ambitious people had visions but no systems, excitement but no follow-through. She could take chaos and organize it into efficiency. She could look at a broken process and see exactly where it fractured. Her parents had watched her career choices with consistent disappointment. Immigrants who'd built their own small business from nothing, they understood work. What they didn't understand was Madison's willingness to work that hard for someone else's vision. "He doesn't deserve you," her mother had said when Madison quit her 6-figure CFO position to join Richard's struggling marketing firm as chief operating officer. Her father had just shaken his head. "A wife should not disappear into a man's business." he'd warned before the small 2013 wedding ceremony. They were right, but not in the way they meant. The truth was more complicated. Richard hadn't married Madison because he recognized her complete value. He'd married her because she believed in the possibility he was selling, because she was available, and because she was the kind of woman who could take a suggestion about improving a system and turn it into something that actually worked. They'd purchased the suburban house together that same year. Their starter castle, Richard called it. His name on the deed first, though her name was on the mortgage alongside his. From 2011 to 2016, Madison had automated processes that saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. She'd hired the right people when everyone else wanted to hire the cheapest people. She'd negotiated contracts that other professionals simply missed. She'd built the actual scaffolding holding up Richard's empire, and she'd done it quietly, professionally, as his business partner and his wife, without needing credit. In client meetings, Richard took the calls. In industry events, Richard shook the hands and accepted the praise. Madison was the person in the background, the one making sure the promises Richard made actually got kept, the one who never missed a deadline, the one who caught problems before they became disasters. They talked about children eventually, after the next milestone, after the next acquisition, after they proved Richard was the genius everyone thought he was. Madison had built an empire with her own hands. She'd done it as the wife nobody knew existed. She was becoming invisible inside her own success, and she was only beginning to understand what that invisibility was costing her and what it would cost her family. In 2014, Richard made a decision that seemed small at the time. He hired an executive assistant named Cassandra Way, 26 years old, fresh from a wealthy family, possessing the kind of casual beauty that comes from never struggling for anything in your life. She wasn't particularly skilled at her job. Details escaped her attention. Emails went unanswered. Calendars were constantly confused. Phone calls were missed. Richard didn't seem to notice or care. Madison noticed immediately. She noticed everything. Over the next 6 months, Madison raised the issue 3 separate times. "She's not managing your schedule efficiently," she said the first time, standing in Richard's office after reviewing a missed meeting. "We're paying her a premium salary for what seems like entry-level performance," she said the second time, showing him the stack of unanswered client emails. "I think we should consider finding someone with more experience," she said the third time, her voice careful, professional, controlled. Richard dismissed each concern with the same pattern. "She's learning," he said. "She has potential," he insisted. "Give her time," he repeated. What Madison would understand much later was that potential had nothing to do with Cassandra's job performance. Potential was what Richard called the quality of being young, beautiful, and impressed by his success. Potential was what he called the absence of the kind of competence that made him feel small by comparison. In 2015, the affair began. Richard would tell himself it didn't really count as infidelity because his marriage to Madison had become something technical, a business arrangement, not a partnership. They hadn't been intimate in years. She was too focused on work, too driven, too much like him and not enough like a wife who existed to admire him. These were lies he rehearsed until they felt true. Madison discovered text messages in March 2016. She hired a private investigator and confirmed everything she suspected: hotel receipts, consistent patterns, the timeline of the betrayal. Instead of leaving immediately, she did what she'd done her entire life. She managed the situation. She scheduled therapy sessions. She insisted Richard fire Cassandra. She negotiated an agreement. No more contact, full financial transparency, genuine commitment to rebuilding their marriage. Richard agreed. He meant it, for approximately 4 months. Then Cassandra was quietly rehired. Different title: Special Projects Coordinator. Different department. Different reporting structure. A position engineered so thoroughly that Madison wouldn't see her every day, wouldn't recognize the pattern, wouldn't have the daily evidence of his continued deception. Except Madison saw it anyway. She always saw everything. A man who can't choose his wife over his pride will keep lying until someone forces him to stop. Madison was learning that forcing him wouldn't be enough. In early 2018, Madison received a comment from her doctor that changed the trajectory of her entire life. She was there for a routine shoulder injury evaluation, nothing serious, just the kind of overuse problem that came from spending 70-hour weeks at a desk. The physician examined her, asked about her health history, and made an offhand observation. Your vitals are excellent. Great cholesterol, strong heart. You're in remarkable shape. Looks like you could have a few more years of fertility if you wanted to. The statement stuck in Madison's mind for weeks. She was getting older. She'd spent her entire adult life on someone else's timeline, first building her parents' business, then building Richard's business, then managing Richard's marriage while he was busy destroying it. She'd never taken time to ask herself what she actually wanted. She'd always been too focused on the next milestone, the next acquisition, the next proof that she was valuable enough to keep around. But something shifted inside her after that doctor's visit. For the first time in her life, Madison wanted something that wasn't on a business plan. She wanted something that had nothing to do with Richard's vision or her parents' expectations. She wanted a child, not because someone else wanted one, but because she suddenly understood that she might regret never having the one thing she'd always thought could wait. She didn't tell Richard. She consulted with fertility specialists privately, attended appointments alone, and received counseling about her options. She took prenatal vitamins with the same precision she brought to quarterly reports. She tracked her cycle like she was managing a project timeline. In March 2018, deliberately and completely without her husband's knowledge or consent, Madison became pregnant. When she finally told Richard in May, his first response was silence. His second response was calculation. He asked practical questions about her timeline, her health, the logistics of pregnancy while managing a business. He made promises about being present and being a father. He told her he was ready for this next chapter. He actually believed some of his own words. But Cassandra wasn't going to accept the role of mistress indefinitely. Not when a baby would tie Madison to Richard forever and complicate the arrangement she'd been enjoying for 3 years. She escalated. She became more visible in the office, more present at Richard's evening events. She texted him constantly with work updates that could have waited until morning. She positioned herself as his emotional confidant, the person who really understood him, unlike his neglectful wife. She told him that Madison would use this baby to control him, that he needed to make a choice, that they could start fresh if he was brave enough to leave everything behind. Richard was intoxicated by the attention and the permission Cassandra provided. For nearly 2 decades, he'd been chasing Madison's approval without ever admitting it. Now someone was offering him an escape hatch, and she was beautiful, and she made him feel young again. By Madison's 7th month of pregnancy, Richard had already decided. He just hadn't told her yet. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is choose herself before anyone else has the chance to choose for her. Madison was hospitalized briefly in July 2018 with gestational hypertension. She'd been monitoring her blood pressure carefully throughout her pregnancy, following every medical recommendation, doing everything right. The hospital stay was precautionary, just a few days of observation and medication adjustment. Richard visited her, held her hand, and promised that everything was going to be fine, that everything was going to work out, that they were going to build this family together. That evening, while Madison was resting in her hospital bed, Cassandra sent Richard a text message. The message was direct. "It's me or her. You have 24 hours. Richard felt trapped, which he always transformed into righteous indignation. He didn't choose Cassandra because he loved her most. He chose her because choosing her meant he didn't have to choose himself. It meant the problem wasn't his character or his failures. It was Madison's unwillingness to understand him. It was her obsession with work. It was her refusal to be the kind of wife he deserved. The lies he told himself were perfectly constructed. The next morning, Richard returned home to their suburban mansion while Madison was still in the hospital recovering. He'd spent the entire night rehearsing what he was going to say, crafting his exit like it was a business pitch. He stood in their bedroom doorway and delivered his speech with the confidence of a man who'd convinced himself he was being brave. "I can't do this anymore," he said. "The marriage isn't working. You're too focused on the business. You don't understand me. I need something different." Madison, still medicated and exhausted from hospitalization, asked the direct question. Is there someone else? No, Richard lied. It's not about another person. It's about finding myself again. He gave her a timeline, 24 hours to pack what she wanted from their shared life. He'd already arranged a temporary apartment, modest, across town, and his lawyer had already drafted a preliminary separation agreement. He was generous with support, he explained, but since she'd become pregnant without his consent, she couldn't expect the same asset division she might otherwise receive. Madison asked about the children. We'll work it out, Richard said, which meant nothing. Once the babies arrive, we can figure out custody arrangements. He left her that morning with $8,000 cash, 2 suitcases of clothes, and 9 weeks until she delivered twins she'd never planned to raise alone. He gave her 24 hours to leave. What he didn't know was that she'd already been planning her escape for much longer. During Madison's brief hospitalization, something extraordinary happened that she never told Richard about, never told anyone about. Something that changed the entire trajectory of what was about to unfold. The blood work done during her hospital stay for gestational hypertension revealed additional information. The doctors requested a private consultation. They sat Madison down in a quiet room and explained, with careful medical precision, what the tests had uncovered. The babies she was carrying weren't biologically hers. The fertility clinic had made an error earlier when Madison had started her treatment. There had been a mix-up in the embryo documentation. The eggs and sperm she'd been told were being used weren't actually being used. Instead, she'd received donor embryos, donor egg and donor sperm combined, and the clinic hadn't caught their mistake until late in Madison's first trimester. Madison sat with this information and felt her entire understanding of her pregnancy shift. These weren't her biological children. They were babies she'd chosen to carry, babies she'd already bonded with over months, but babies whose genetics had nothing to do with her own. The hospital made an unusual offer. Given the clinic's liability and their significant error, Madison could accept financial compensation, pursue legal action, or contact the biological donors if she wanted additional information. The clinic was covering their mistake generously, they explained, offering a substantial settlement and flexibility on her options. Madison asked for the biological donor's information, but said nothing to Richard. She understood immediately why she had to keep this secret. If Richard knew the children weren't biologically his, he'd use that information strategically. He'd already been looking for reasons to leave, already been constructing justifications for his departure. Knowing that the twins had no genetic connection to him would become another weapon in whatever custody fight was coming. She signed confidentiality agreements with the clinic. She accepted their settlement, $3.2 million, and deposited it into an account she opened independently in her name only. It was insurance. It was escape money. It was her guarantee that whatever happened in her marriage, she would never be financially dependent on a man who'd already proven himself willing to trade her reliability for someone else's novelty. Over the following months, as Madison packed her belongings and moved into the temporary apartment Richard had arranged, as she prepared to deliver twins she was carrying but didn't create, she carried this knowledge silently. These babies weren't connected to her by biology, but they were connected to her by choice. She'd decided to carry them before they existed. That decision, made in the privacy of her own determination, made them completely hers. The most powerful choice a woman can make isn't about her circumstances. It's about deciding what remains hers when everything else is being taken away. Twin boys arrived on a cold Thursday in November, 8 weeks after Richard's 24-hour eviction notice. Gabriel and Avery, healthy, perfect, indistinguishable to anyone who didn't know their complicated beginning. Richard showed up at the hospital the morning after they were born. He brought flowers, expensive ones. He looked at the babies with genuine emotion, the kind that wasn't entirely performance. He told Madison he wanted to be present, that he wanted to be an active father, that he was committed to co-parenting meaningfully, even though the marriage was over. Madison didn't believe his promises of reconciliation would last, but she understood something crucial. Richard genuinely wanted to be involved in the twins' lives, and his commitment to co-parenting could secure better custody arrangements and stronger financial support than fighting him would provide. So she accepted his flowers. She accepted his promises. She accepted his performance of fatherhood because strategically accepting his involvement served her actual goal, protecting her children and securing resources while managing his departure. The separation agreement gave Richard overnight visitation after the boys reached 6 months old. He was committed to his schedule. He didn't disappear into Cassandra's life completely. He maintained the co-parenting framework, at least initially. By that time, he'd officially moved Cassandra into a penthouse apartment across the city. He presented her to his business associates as his new partner, his fresh start, the woman who truly understood him. At the office, Richard had already begun constructing the narrative that would define how people saw his marriage. Madison had been emotionally absent. She'd been too focused on work, too difficult to live with. He'd had to leave. Everyone understood, or at least everyone he wanted to impress acted like they did. His colleagues largely sided with him. Men who were also trying to convince themselves that leaving difficult wives while becoming active fathers was a sign of strength rather than abandonment. Women who'd never seen Madison do the actual work, who only saw Richard at industry events, who didn't know that the entire company was built on infrastructure that Madison had created. The business continued to thrive under the systems Madison had established. The automation she'd designed kept running. The people she'd hired kept performing. Richard took full credit while positioning himself as the co-parenting father who showed up consistently. Meanwhile, Madison was managing the week-to-week logistics of raising two newborns alone. 6 a.m. feedings, midnight diaper changes, doctor's appointments, the first fever, the first smile, all of it while she was working part-time as a consultant because full-time work was impossible with newborn twins. When Richard's overnight visits began at 6 months, he arrived on schedule with expensive gifts. Designer baby equipment, high-end clothing, things that documented his role as an active father without requiring him to understand what actual fatherhood meant beyond the performance. A man who shows up sometimes always looks more impressive than a woman who shows up always. That's not justice. That's just how people measure things. While Richard was performing success with Cassandra, Madison was building something real. He married Cassandra in 2020, officially divorced from Madison after the separation proceedings finalized in late 2019. The contested custody battles and asset division negotiations had stretched for more than a year, but finally Richard was legally free to move forward with his new life. He announced the marriage to his colleagues like he was declaring a new beginning, the fresh start, the right choice, the life he was supposed to have been living all along. What Richard didn't see was that Madison had already stopped waiting for him to validate her existence. During those same years, while he was fighting custody arrangements and finalizing asset settlements, Madison was building something real. She accepted a consultant position that paid less than her previous CFO salary, but offered flexibility. The kind of flexibility that allowed her to be present for her children while still building something substantial. She worked from home during the twins' early years, managing projects for companies that desperately needed her organizational skills, collecting fees that she immediately invested strategically. The $3.2 million settlement from the fertility clinic had become seed funding for something ambitious. Madison began quietly acquiring undervalued small businesses, a printing company with outdated management, a digital service bureau that was profitable but disorganized, a logistics firm with solid revenue but poor leadership structure. She applied everything she'd learned building Richard's company while deliberately removing the parts that had nearly destroyed her. She hired people she could trust. She built transparent systems where credit went to the people doing the work. She operated with integrity that wasn't performed for an audience, but genuinely practiced every single day. By the time the twins turned 5 years old, Madison had built a portfolio of businesses worth approximately $7.2 million. She was still building, still investing, still expanding. She didn't broadcast this success. She didn't attend industry events. She didn't seek media attention or post about her accomplishments on social media. She was deliberately, strategically invisible, and that invisibility was the source of her freedom. Richard's wealth was public, loud, performed. Madison's wealth was quiet, substantial, real. The twins navigated two households with completely different energies. At Richard's penthouse apartment with Cassandra, everything was expensive and impressive. The furniture was designer. The view was prestigious. The atmosphere was about looking successful. At Madison's home, everything was comfortable and functional. Books everywhere, a workspace where Madison managed her businesses, a kitchen where they cooked together. The atmosphere was about actually building something that mattered. The twins loved both homes in the uncomplicated way children do, before they developed the frameworks to understand that appearance and substance aren't always aligned. Gabriel and Avery grew up in two distinct worlds, and from ages 3 to 5, they were learning the language of those two worlds without fully understanding yet what they meant. At Richard's penthouse on weekends, their father was impressive. He took them to expensive restaurants where the servers knew his name. He purchased toys that looked impressive but weren't particularly interesting to play with. He documented everything: photographs of the boys in designer clothes, videos of moments he'd orchestrated, proof that he was an involved father. He loved them. The boys never doubted that. But his love looked like performance. It looked like proving something to someone. It didn't look like showing up when they weren't feeling well, or sitting with them through confusing emotions, or the thousand small moments that actually compose a childhood. He called them my sons, with a kind of ownership that felt different from how Madison said it. When Richard said it, it sounded like declaration, like proof of something, like something he was claiming. The twins could feel the difference without understanding it. At Madison's home, every day was routine: morning breakfast, school preparation, afternoon activities, evening conversations. Nothing particularly impressive to photograph, nothing that proved anything to anyone. Just the consistent presence of a woman who'd chosen something before they existed, who showed up for every moment, good and complicated and ordinary. Madison never explained where they came from in the way Richard sometimes implied she should. She didn't need to. She was present. That was explanation enough. The twins understood, in the way that children understand before they develop adult frameworks. They belong somewhere. At Madison's home, they belong completely. At Richard's penthouse, they belong conditionally. Present when he had time, important when he had an audience, somewhat less important when he didn't. They also noticed, without having words for it yet, that their father sometimes seemed disappointed when he looked at them. Like he was seeing something that didn't match what he'd expected. Like they were not quite the reflection of himself he'd imagined when he was performing the role of involved father. Madison never seemed disappointed. She seemed relieved. Like carrying them, raising them, choosing them repeatedly. That was exactly what she wanted to be doing. The twins were learning something fundamental about love before they were old enough to articulate it. Love wasn't something you were born naturally understanding. Love was something people showed you through presence, through consistency, through showing up when it was difficult, not just when it was convenient. Richard showed up on weekends with gifts and photographs. Madison showed up every single day with homework help and quiet conversations, and the kind of presence that doesn't need documentation to matter. The twins didn't know their own story yet. They didn't know about donor embryos or fertility clinics or the secret their mother was carrying. They just knew that one parent felt like choice and the other felt like obligation. In 2024, Cassandra's younger sister made a suggestion that seemed innocent: a family DNA ancestry project, something fun, something to trace heritage and discover interesting family history. She ordered kits for everyone. Cassandra was enthusiastic. Richard agreed without hesitation, confident in his identity, confident in his narrative about his sons. The results came back within weeks. Cassandra's ancestry report showed exactly what she expected: predominantly German and Irish, with some Scandinavian roots. Richard's results revealed his Eastern European heritage more prominently than he'd realized. Standard results, expected outcomes. Then Gabriel and Avery's results arrived. The DNA testing service flagged the results as unusual. The company reached out to Richard directly, suggesting there might have been an error and offering to retest at no charge. Richard sat with the documentation in his private office and experienced something he'd never truly experienced before: a consequence he couldn't manipulate, negotiate, or charm his way through. The results were unmistakable. Gabriel and Avery had no genetic connection to Richard. None. No father-son markers. No biological relationship that would justify the legal agreements he'd signed, the custody arrangements he'd fought for, the identity he'd constructed around being their father. His first instinct was to call his lawyer. His second was to contact the testing company and demand they verify the results again. His third, occurring hours later, was a slow-burning realization that his entire constructed narrative had been built on a foundation that didn't exist. He couldn't ignore the results. He couldn't pretend they didn't exist. Cassandra now knew the twins weren't biologically his, which meant she possessed information that could be weaponized. The test results meant that his escape route, the one he'd justified by telling everyone he needed to find himself, had been built on lies he didn't even know he was living. What made it worse was the question he couldn't stop asking himself. Had Madison known? He spent the entire evening constructing theories. Had she deliberately deceived him? Had she used the pregnancy to trap him into a marriage he wanted to leave anyway? Had she somehow orchestrated this entire situation to keep him bound to her through children that weren't even his? The possibilities were intoxicating. They offered him something he desperately wanted: an excuse, a justification for abandoning her, a reason to feel like the victim in his own story. By midnight, Richard had decided on his next move. He would contact Madison and demand answers. He would request documentation from the fertility clinic. He would pursue additional custody negotiations with this new information. He stopped himself. Because somewhere beneath all of this, Richard understood something terrifying. That biological father, actual father, that the children he'd been raising for 6 years, the children he'd used as emotional weapons in negotiations with Madison, the children whose existence had justified his entire escape plan. These children had called him Dad for their entire lives, and he'd never actually chosen them, not once. He'd only performed the role. The moment he discovered the truth, Richard realized the real lie wasn't Madison's. It was his own. The lie that biology is what makes a father. Richard contacted Madison for the first time in years with something approaching civility. No anger in his voice yet, just careful calculation. He needed information. He needed documentation. He needed to understand what had happened and when and why she hadn't told him. Madison didn't defend herself. She didn't apologize. She simply offered to meet, not for reconciliation, but for clarity. She brought documentation from the fertility clinic, information she could share without violating her confidentiality agreement, since Richard now had legitimate legal interest. She explained what had happened, when she'd discovered it, and why she hadn't told him. The explanation was logical, methodical, professional. Exactly what Richard should have expected from Madison. "I didn't tell you," she said, "because you'd already decided to leave me. You were looking for reasons to justify it. Knowing the twins weren't biologically yours would have just given you another excuse, another layer of justification for the choices you'd already made," Richard argued. He accused her of manipulation. He demanded to know why she'd kept the information hidden for 6 years, during every custody negotiation, throughout every legal proceeding. Madison's response shifted something inside him. Not redemption, not yet, but recognition. "Because I was protecting my children from the kind of abandonment you were already considering," she said. "Their genetic origin doesn't change their needs, their confusion, or their right to have a parent who chose them. You've been their father for 6 years whether you wanted to be or not. Biology is irrelevant to that." Richard felt his carefully constructed justifications collapsing. "That's not fair," he said. "I should have known. I had the right to know." Madison looked at him directly. "What you had was a choice. You had the choice to be a father to 2 children who needed you. That's all you've ever had. That's all any parent has. Biology doesn't create that choice. Showing up does." The conversation ended without resolution. No apologies from either direction, no promises to rebuild or reconcile, just clarity about what had happened and why the truth had been hidden until Richard was ready to hear it, which apparently required a DNA test to force him to pay attention. That night, Richard sat in his office and understood, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, that Madison had been protecting not herself, but the children from his performance of fatherhood. She'd known something fundamental about him that he was only beginning to recognize, that he had never truly chosen those boys. He had only used them. The woman he'd left for freedom had spent 6 years protecting his children from the truth about him. That's when Richard understood what real strength looked like. After the DNA test exposure, Richard's ability to focus on his business crumbled, like a structure built on sand that's been exposed to water. His second marriage to Cassandra deteriorated under the strain of knowing she'd held information he didn't have for several hours before he received his results. He couldn't forgive her for that inequality of knowledge. He couldn't move past the realization that even his mistress-turned-wife had secrets from him. More importantly, he couldn't manage his company while consuming himself with anger at Madison, at Cassandra, at the universe for complicating his narrative. Key employees, people Madison had hired years earlier, people with institutional knowledge and actual competence, left to start their own firm. They took clients with them. They took relationships with them. They took the infrastructure that had been holding Richard's empire together all along. The company that had been worth $47 million began to decline. Not spectacularly, not all at once, but steadily, visibly, undeniably. Clients migrated to the new firm started by Madison's former hires. Revenue decreased. Profit margins contracted. Richard's lawyer repeated the same advice at every consultation. You have legal obligations to these children regardless of biological connection. Most jurisdictions don't erase parental responsibilities based on genetic testing. You're legally their father. That won't change because of DNA. This enraged Richard. He felt trapped by biology he didn't have, by legal agreements he'd assumed would dissolve if circumstances changed, by the audacity of a woman who'd apparently deceived him about the fundamental nature of his own family. What he didn't understand was that he was experiencing what most adults never face, actual consequences that couldn't be negotiated away. His second divorce proceedings mirrored his first, contentious, full of blame, full of accusations. Cassandra used the DNA information strategically in custody disputes and asset division negotiations. Richard found himself fighting battles on multiple fronts: his deteriorating business, his dissolving marriage, his questions about the legitimacy of his relationship with Gabriel and Avery. The court ordered family therapy as a condition of continued parental visitation. Richard resisted initially. Therapy felt like failure. Therapy felt like admitting something was wrong with him rather than with his circumstances. He attended anyway, because the alternative was losing access to the boys completely. In those therapy sessions, sitting across from a counselor who asked difficult questions about his choices and his commitments, Richard began something he'd never attempted before. He began looking honestly at himself, not with justification, not with narrative construction, just honest observation of a man who'd spent his entire life building empires of performance while neglecting to build anything real. Inside the therapy office, Richard began something he'd never attempted. He stopped performing. The first real breakthrough came during his third session, when his therapist asked a question that fractured his carefully constructed narrative. Tell me about a time when you made a decision based on someone else's needs instead of your own advancement. Richard couldn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, because he genuinely couldn't recall an instance. Over the following weeks, Richard began to see himself through a different lens. His therapist helped him externalize his patterns, separate Richard, the person, from performance, the mechanism he'd built to survive. He started understanding that the need to always appear successful, always be impressive, always be right, was a story he'd been telling himself since his broke years. The story was, if I stop performing, I stop existing. But it wasn't true. In session 5, Richard described his departure from Madison. As he spoke, his therapist asked him to imagine telling the same story from her perspective. What had she seen? What had she experienced? For the first time, Richard considered that his justified escape looked like abandonment from her viewpoint. His fresh start looked like her devastation. The recognition made him nauseous. By week 8, Richard began identifying what his therapist called unique outcomes. Moments when he'd actually chosen people instead of using them. They were rare, precious, mostly involving moments with Gabriel and Avery when he'd forgotten to perform and just been present. These moments, his therapist explained, were the foundation for who he could become if he chose differently. Richard realized something devastating. He'd spent his entire adult life running from ordinariness, convinced that being average meant being invisible. But Madison had built a genuine empire while remaining invisible. His sons had called him Dad, while he remained emotionally absent. Cassandra had left him while he performed affection. The things he'd been running toward, status, validation, impressiveness, were hollow. The things he'd been running from, ordinariness, consistency, actual presence, were where real life happened. One night after a session, Richard sat in his car and understood that he couldn't fix what he'd done to Madison or rebuild what he'd never built with his sons through performance. The only possible path forward required him to stop performing entirely and start showing up as a person, imperfectly and consistently, even when nobody was watching to validate it. It wasn't redemption, it was the foundation for change, and it terrified him. While Richard was finally confronting himself in therapy, Madison's quiet empire continued building, now substantial enough that Richard was forced to acknowledge what he'd never seen before. Her business portfolio reached $8.5 million in valuation by 2023. She remarried in 2023 to someone who understood that her wealth came from genuine competence, not inheritance or luck. Her new partner was an engineer, someone who built things and understood that building required actual work, not performance. The twins, now 12 years old, watched their mother marry for partnership rather than rescue. They observed her creating something authentic alongside someone who valued authenticity. They saw her have a third child, a biological daughter, and watched their mother's love for Gabriel and Avery not diminish by 1 degree because of genetic connection. Richard finally read about Madison's business success in industry publications he'd never expected to see her name in. His shock was profound. The woman he'd dismissed as too focused on work had been building a genuine empire the entire time he was performing his own. Her success was documented nowhere he cared about. No social media updates, no industry event appearances, no public validation. Just steady, consistent building of something real. More significantly, Madison had done what Richard had never managed. She'd built something that didn't require an audience to be real. Richard's wealth, once $47 million at its peak, had declined significantly since the business began hemorrhaging clients. His company's valuation was now uncertain, his liquid assets diminishing. Meanwhile, Madison's $8.5 million continued building steadily, protected by diversification and genuine competence, rather than dependent on any single relationship or performance. The difference wasn't in the current numbers, it was in the foundation. His diminished wealth had been constructed from performance and relationships he'd exploited. Her wealth was constructed from actual competence and people she'd helped succeed. One of Richard's colleagues mentioned, casually, that they'd hired Madison's consulting firm for strategic restructuring. The colleague was impressed by her work, by her methodology, by her ability to see where systems failed and fix them without needing credit. This same colleague had worked with Richard for years and had never described him with that kind of respect. Richard realized that Madison hadn't waited for him to discover her value. She discovered it herself and built an entire life around it. She hadn't needed his validation. She'd never needed it. The only person who'd needed validation was Richard, and he'd spent years trying to get it from a woman who'd already moved beyond needing anything from him. Gabriel and Avery, now 16 years old, scheduled a conversation with their father. Not a casual visit or a weekend at his apartment, an actual conversation where they wanted to talk about family, about truth, about what came next. Preston arrived nervous in a way he rarely allowed himself to feel. His sons were almost adults now. They were intelligent, observant, and they'd spent their entire lives navigating between two versions of parenthood. One genuine and consistent, one performed and conditional. Gabriel spoke first. "We know about the DNA test. We know we're not biologically yours. Mom explained everything when we were old enough to understand." Preston's instinct was to defend, to explain, to construct narrative. Instead, he stayed silent. Avery continued, "What we want to know is whether you're going to keep performing being our dad, or if you're going to actually choose us." The question hung in the air, the same question Preston's therapist had asked him months earlier. "When have you ever actually chosen someone?" "I don't know if I know how," Preston said honestly. "No performance, no justification, just truth." "Then learn," Gabriel said simply. "We're your sons. You get to choose that repeatedly for the rest of your lives, but you have to actually choose." They set boundaries, real ones. Preston could have their time, but it had to be consistent and genuine. He could be their father, but only if he showed up as a person, not as an idea. He couldn't miss events. He couldn't be distracted. He couldn't perform love and then disappear when the performance was over. Preston agreed to everything because finally he understood something fundamental, that actual fatherhood isn't about biology or performance. It's about showing up repeatedly, especially when nobody's watching, especially when it's difficult. Over the following months, Preston showed up on time. He was present in conversations. He didn't need documentation or photographs. He was just there, a father learning, slowly and imperfectly, to actually choose his sons instead of using them. The twins understood they couldn't make him into the father they deserved, but they could require him to show up, and in showing up consistently, Preston began something that looked nothing like redemption. It looked like actual change. Family isn't what we're born into. It's what we choose repeatedly, even when nobody's watching, especially when nobody's watching.